Destination Africa, brought to you by Standard Bank.
Let's pick up, Jeannot, with you, because ahead of the break, Andrew had touched on the importance of regional integration and how individual countries could leverage off relationships in that regard. But again, it brings us to the whole argument of policy and regulation and how that's still acting as a hindrance to that possibly coming to the fore.
It was a very important point that Andrew raised in the sense that, I mean, we need some kind of transnational project in Africa, but at the same time, we talked about IPPs. You have the issue of regulatory environment which prevent an IPP located, let's say, in Zambia, from selling electricity to SOEs or, let's say, Eskom in South Africa. So you need to have that link, and this link is the regulatory challenge that needs to be changed in order for that to happen. If this is not met by a combination of discussion at the government level and the private sector level for that to happen, we are not likely to see the development of significant IPPs in other countries like Zambia or Nigeria, unless they sell electricity to end users which are located already in their own country. So there's a change of regulatory stance that need to happen in order for that to become a reality.
Raymond, what's your view on the regulation that's out there, the red tape issues that we still need to get past if we're going to be telling this infrastructure story properly and building it from here on out?
It is absolutely critical that we have alignment with the regulatory authorities, because I'm aware of circumstances where the lack of alignment has caused the both project schedule and cost to escalate. You know, it's important that whereas we talk about skills to implement projects, it's important that the alignment within the regulatory authorities, say for instance the water authority, giving permits for things to happen, for access through wetlands and things like that. Those must be done timeously. They mustn't take too long, because when they take too long, the knock-on impact on the infrastructure project is massive, and often people don't realize it. It just seems to me that imperative is not
Andrew,
captured.
What's interesting is that we do see a different dynamic playing itself out, certainly when we hear about cooperative relationships between African governments and China, for example. And let's use that as a case in point, where you've got possibly Chinese investment coming into the mining sector, and that approved if it comes hand in hand with a commitment to developing surrounding infrastructure. What's your view on that approach and the kind of inroads we're seeing in that regard, and the traction we're seeing there?
Alishia, you should have joined the three of us 5 minutes before we came on camera, because that's exactly what we're talking about. And I think the reality is that China's not going to go away. It recognizes Africa as critically important as a source for raw materials, whether that be iron ore to fuel production back home, and also for the likes of oil. And I think that, and this is just a South African point of view, over the last few years we've seen, I think originally a reticence to work with the Chinese, particularly some of the big contractors, realizing that it is now awfully difficult to outbid them. So instead of working against them, let's work with them. And I think that's a more of a pragmatic and broader view. But the footprint, the Chinese footprint in Africa is growing at a phenomenal rate, and I think for a lot of governments, it's a question of, well, if the Chinese are willing to fund our projects, whether it be port rehabilitation, new railroads, roads, and they're willing to construct them by bringing their own contractors, well, so be it.
Yeah.
And we understand that there are off-take agreements and attached to those contracts. But at the end of the day, it's taking development forward.
Well, of course, it's easier to get those with vested interests on board and, coming to the party. What's the value proposition for a company in the construction space, for example? So let's take a Stefanuti or a Raubex here in South Africa, and that South African firm coming in to develop roads.
Well, I mean, you mentioned particular companies here, but I think if you look at the sector in broad terms, what's happened over the last 2 years. This is well, let's say over the last year, following the euphoria of building South Africa's infrastructure for 2010. I think a lot of those contractors and the ones that you've mentioned, and this is certainly reflected in their share price. Order books are soft at the moment. They're looking to acquire work cross-border, but is a project that they are willing to fund themselves, or, and this is my experience, I think a lot of them are targeting on the likes of World Bank, ADB funded projects, where at the end of the day it's international competitive bidding. Yes, it's very competitive. You're up against contractors from Europe, from elsewhere in Africa. But at the end of the day, if you are technically competent and your bid is competitive, you are going to win the work.
But then comes in this challenge where, Jeannot, you highlighted earlier that a lot of the investment we are seeing comes from government, and we know that one of the hindrances to construction firms, certainly from South Africa, expanding their African footprint has been their reliance on that government work, and in many instances, no guarantee on payment of that work once it's done.
That's an important point that you just raised. It's important to understand that for South African construction companies trying to venture into other African countries, the government has put in place the ECIC, which might help them in venturing into African countries. It's a kind of political and commercial cover, risk cover that the ECIC does provide. It's pretty interesting in the sense that you don't have some kind of constraint in terms of country limit, in terms of funding, etc. But having said that, it is clear that the construction sector is likely, to me, to remain subdued at least for the short term, like you said, because the order book is pretty soft, which means that expanding the footprint in Africa is likely to be the key issue going forward, and Standard Bank is likely to be supporting that going forward.
Yeah, let's take a look at South Africa's emergence now as part of the BRIC nations. Raymond, what kind of position do you see this opening up for the continent as a whole, and the kind of platform this provides for investment in the infrastructure place moving forward?
Well, I think the depth of the construction expertise in South Africa is quite strong. If you look at the perhaps limited number of large firms that can construct complex projects, it indicates a strength in the South African construction sector. What is important, my understanding of South Africa's role within the BRICS formation is that it's a foothold, if you like, to the African continent, and I think that there is huge opportunity for South African firms to leverage that impetus to go into the continent. But I just want to touch on to what was just said about perhaps the reluctance of major companies, construction companies, to go into Africa. I think it's important, even though it's a difficult subject altogether, to look at the transparency of fund administration, because we maybe we want to shy away from this word corruption. It's something that is a major concern in delivery, and it's something that must be addressed if infrastructure development on the continent must accelerate.
Well, certainly in that regard, I came across a very interesting comment. Investing funds without tackling inefficiencies would be like pouring water into a leaking bucket.